welcome to everybody. The History Department of Baldwin Wallace University welcomes you to the Marting Lecture Series. Professor Norman Clary of the History Department established the lecture series in 1989 to highlight scholarship in the humanities. Once each semester, a different department in the School of Humanities brings to campus a distinguished guest lecturer in the humanities, and past speakers have included, that is from the discipline of history at any rate, have included Robin Winks of Yale, Lawrence Stone of Princeton, Lawrence Kaplan of Kansas State University, H.W. Brands of Texas A&M, Osama Makdisi of Rice, Bruce Cummings of the University of Chicago, Rita Warnica of Arizona State, and John David Smith of the University of North Carolina. And we have with us tonight Norman Clary, Professor Emeritus of Baldwin Wallace University, who's the founder of this program. So,
hi everybody.
Thanks, Norman. I'd also like to thank Cleveland State University for co-sponsoring this event with us. And Abdurrahman Tayara is here from the Arabic Department of Cleveland State University. So, thanks, Hamid. And we have with us tonight Dr. Everett Rowson from New York University. He holds a BA in Classics from Princeton University and earned his PhD in Arabic and Islamic Studies from Yale. He's taught in the best Middle Eastern Studies programs in the country, University of California, Berkeley, Harvard, University of Pennsylvania, and of course now NYU, which is the best program in Middle Eastern Studies in the world, in my opinion, turning out the most innovative thinkers and the most creative, impressive research. Dr. Rowson has numerous publications, including A Muslim Philosopher on the Soul and Its Fate, Al-Amri's Kitab al-Amad al-Abid, a translation of volume 22 of the 10th century historian Tabari's massive multi-volume History of Prophet and Kings. That's a 39-volume series, by the way, and I think Dr. Rowson also did the index for that series, if I'm not mistaken. He also produced a critical edition of 3 shadow plays by the 14th century Mamluk author Muhammad ibn Daniel, an edited anthology entitled Homoeroticism in Classical Arabic Literature, and with others, a critical edition of the works of Abbasid era historian and geographer Ibn Wardi al-Yaqubi. He's currently preparing a book on homosexuality in the pre-modern Middle East. Dr. Rowson's approach to scholarship is emblematic of research in the humanities. His deep knowledge of Arabic cultural products, particularly texts of the early Islamic period, and their terminologies and the context that produced them. And these cultural products contain stories, anecdotes, poems, jokes, songs that tell us how their authors thought about and categorized and valued different sexual behaviors and different gendered performances. Dr. Rowson has also very generously provided us with electronic copies of his articles related to our topic tonight, and we provided a sign-up sheet at the back of the room where Brenda Lennox is. So if any of these titles sound interesting to you, please provide us with your email and we will provide you with electronic copies of the articles, including the categorization of gender and sexual irregularity in medieval Arabic vice lists, 2 homoerotic narratives from Mamluk literature, homoerotic liaisons among the Mamluk elite in late medieval Egypt and Syria, and the traffic in boys, slavery and homoerotic liaisons in the elite Abbasid society. I've also included some copies of articles that profoundly affected my own research, one on the effeminates of early Medina, which is about males who performed effeminate gender identities in the early Islamic period, and gender irregularity as entertainment, institutionalized transvestism at the caliphal court in medieval Baghdad, which discusses male and female cross-dressing and suggests that these early Islamic societies were not as wedded to the male-female binary as we sometimes assume. So again, if you provide your email address to us, we'll be happy to provide copies of those articles. So Dr. Rowson will be speaking to us tonight about Islam and homosexuality, historical perspectives, and contemporary contradictions. And there'll be a short Q&A after the talk. So please welcome Dr. Rowson.
For that kind introduction. I'm honored and pleased to be able to be here tonight to talk to you. My first time in England. It's also an opportunity. Many of you will be aware of the intense and sometimes lethal homophobic attitudes on the part of contemporary radical Muslims, if not contemporary Muslim societies altogether. What I want to do tonight is essentially complicate and contextualize that perception. I am a medievalist, so what I want to do is to focus primarily on the pre-modern Islamic attitudes towards homosexuality. Basically, I want to cover 3 points. Homosexuality in medieval secular, quote-unquote, sources. Secular is a tricky word in these societies, but literary mainly, and poetic. In medieval religious sources, and in modern Islamic discourse. What I want to show is that it's all, in several ways, rather fraught. I want to begin with an Arabic poem from the late 9th century in Baghdad. The poem is by Ibn al-Mu'taz, who is the son of a caliph, himself an important poet and literary critic, and who lost his life in a failed coup in the year 908 that put him on the throne for a day. Now, I have to contextualize this poem a bit. You should know that in 9th century, 10th century Iraq, and really the Arab world in general, Muslim literary people and others, part of the elite, enjoyed going out of the cities into the countryside and visiting Christian monasteries, where they would basically have picnics, and were also able to enjoy the wine, which they weren't supposed to drink, but they drank in rather large quantities, that was largely made by the Christians in the monasteries. And they wrote poetry about it. And this is one of the more famous poems about a monastery. The name of the poem is Der Adun. Der means monastery in Arabic. And I'll have to stop a few times while reading it to contextualize. But the poem goes like this. It's 10 lines long. May rain fall on Mesopotamia and its shadowy trees, and on Der Adun in refreshing showers. Long ago, I was awakened there for the morning drink, in early dawn, when the birds were still in their nests. It was accustomed to have a morning drink and an evening drink of wine. I was awakened by the voices of monks in a monastery, intoning their prayers, black-bearded, singing aloud before sunrise, wearing the zunnar around their waists. This is a sash that Christians and Jews were supposed to wear to identify themselves. And on their heads they had arranged the hair in crowns. When I teach my students this, I have to explain first that what's meant here is a tonsure, and then usually I have to explain what a tonsure is these days. Even saying, don't you know about Friar Tuck doesn't always do it. There were many a boy among them with a pretty face, his eyes painted with kohl, casting down coquettishly his lids over their whites. I followed him with longing glances until he acquiesced in obedience, promising to meet me by a wink of the eye. He came wrapped in the cloak of night, hastening his step out of fear and caution. The crescent moon shed its light, almost exposing him as if it was a chip of the fingernail cut off. I spread my cheek on the way for him in humility, and I dragged my sleeves over the traces. This is echoing a very famous pre-Islamic Arabic poem where the poet has a midnight tryst with a lady outside the camp of the nomadic camp, and they pull their rope over the footprints in the sand so nobody will see and realize that they've been out there. So I spread my cheek on the way for him in humility, and I dragged my sleeves over the traces. Then happened what happened, which I shall never tell. So think the best of it and do not ask. So, this is a very typical love poem from the 9th century, 10th, sorry, 9th. He died in 908. Echoing a tradition that is not that old, actually, in Arabic. Let me add before I go into that this poem, which is basically about a seduction of a Christian boy, the last line of this poem, "Then happened what happened, which I shall never tell, so think the best of it and do not ask," is famously quoted 2 centuries later by Al-Ghazali, perhaps the most famous medieval religious scholar in Islam, in his autobiography when he's describing his discovery of Sufism, Islamic mysticism, and is attempting to describe the mystical ecstasy. He quotes anonymously that line, which I've always found rather bemusing, the shift in context from the homosexual seduction to love of God, although perhaps I should add immediately that the parallels between earthly love and sometimes earthy love and love of God are frequent, actually, throughout the pre-modern Islamic tradition. Poetry is the art of the Arabs. They always took pride in it. The tradition goes back to pre-Islamic times. In early Islam, love poetry specifically developed somewhat slowly and was uniformly heteroerotic until about the second half of the 8th century, a little over a century after the rise of Islam and the Prophet Muhammad. Rather abruptly, we began to get homoerotic poetry, love poetry. And it develops quite quickly, and it becomes dominant, basically. By the 10th century, most love poetry, the majority of it, is homoerotic rather than heteroerotic. This continues to be the case through the whole medieval period and down to the 19th century. I'm mainly going to be talking about Arabic tonight, but this same situation obtains once we have developed literatures in Persian and Turkish as well, and if anything, the situation is more extreme in Persian than it is in Arabic. An example of this is perhaps the most famous homoerotic poet of all, Abu Nuwas, who died about 813 in Baghdad. Composed poetry, love poetry of various types. He's collected poems that were organized by genre, which is unusual in Arabic. And there are 3 relevant sections of his diwan, as it's called, in this context. There's the collection of love poems about women, and then the much larger section on love poems about boys, and then there's the third one, which is licentious poetry. Basically, a split develops very quickly between chaste romantic poetry, which has a range of emotions in it, but it's almost very chaste, and obscene poetry, which at this time also develops into a fully recognized genre, which can be heterosexual or homosexual, it can be either one. And the obscene poetry is also a genre that had staying power down to the 19th century. The attitudes that we find reflected in this poetry raise questions about why did this turn up when it did? Lack of continuity or continuity. As I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, there's a lot of resemblance in the medieval period of homoeroticism in Islam to ancient Greek and Latin classical views on the topic, to the extent that it seems very difficult not to find some continuity between the two. Unfortunately, our textual sources don't allow us to track this down. In the crucial centuries from the 6th century to the 9th, we just don't have texts that can show us this kind of continuity happening. I can posit with some certainty that what we're getting is the Arab conquests with the rise of Islam taking a while to percolate and mix with attitudes in the settled cultures. So there's a delay before these things start arising in what we can find in texts. We do have a few clues that are more concrete than that. One example I can give is the author Jahiz, who died in 868 in Baghdad, wrote, among many other things, he's probably the most famous prose writer of Arabic before modern times. He wrote a boasting match, a debate between the desirability of women and boys for sexual pleasure. And there's an advocate of women and an advocate of boys, and they argue back and forth which one's better. I can't tell you who wins because it finally just peters out at the end, and he's afraid he's getting his reader bored, so he just tacks on 29 sex jokes that have nothing to do with the debate. But although you can tell from other writings of his that he's really on the women's side on this one. But the fact is, this topic of a debate between women and boys is known in Greek. We have 3 examples of it in ancient Greek. So here's something that cannot be a coincidence, even though we can't track how you get from A to B. Jahiz also has a theory about why homoeroticism pops up when it does, at the late 7th century, 8th century. He says, this all happened at the time of the Abbasid Revolution, when the Abbasids conquered the previous dynasty of Umayyad caliphs, swept them away. Their armies started in eastern Iran and marched west. The capital was in Damascus, and they finally defeated their predecessors, the Umayyads. According to Jahiz, the general that led this revolution unusually did not allow the soldiers to take their families with them. Therefore, the frustrated soldiers had to have sexual recourse to their pages instead. And this is how it caught on and was taken up by the settled people in Baghdad and elsewhere. This theory is still sometimes reproduced today, although I find it totally implausible, in fact. But what I think it is an example of a much broader phenomenon, which is the importation theory of homosexuality. We got it from them, and the them varies in different cultures. I always parallel that with the other, even more common theory, which has some merit but is often overstated, which I think of as the hydraulic theory. Homosexuality arises because women are not available for one reason or another, and therefore you've got to turn elsewhere. The two overlap, obviously. The most important thing I think I need to say about what we find in literature about homoeroticism at this time is the importance of role. There is no word for homosexuality in Arabic or for homosexual. All there is several words for active sodomite and passive sodomite. These are not bracketed together because they aren't seen as a single thing. They are two different complementary things, just as, so to speak, being male and female are different but complementary. And this affects pretty much everything. It also indicates that sodomy, well, in the first place, sodomy is the sexual activity between males. By that I mean anal penetration. And penetration is crucial. The way they categorize things is not, as in the modern West, that a person is oriented towards a person and desires a person of a given sex. They assume that what's paramount is what you do, which is either penetrate or be penetrated. And therefore, attitudes towards people engaging in sodomy, or even people who abstain but would like to, perhaps, differ, given these two roles. And in some, if you are a penetrator in anal intercourse, that's naughty. But it's not much more than that in popular perceptions. Whereas if you are an adult male who is penetrated, that is disgusting and pathological and despised. If you are a teenage boy, it's not so bad, you'll get over it, is the general attitude. And like the Greeks, the paradigmatic relationship in homosexual relations is a mature man with a teenager, more or less. It's hard to pin down exact ages. I know of only one poet who actually talks about ages at all, which is somewhat helpful but problematical. But usually where age matters concerns the beard. Everyone had beards who could have a beard in these societies. It was shameful not to have a beard. Boys are often referred to as beardless in the poetry. But then there's a debate within the poetry itself about the role of beards, because the general view is a boy is at his most attractive just when his beard is beginning to sprout, when he has a soft down on his cheeks. When his beard grows out fully, it is assumed that he is no longer attractive to men at all. This shows up in the poetry, but of course this is typical of Arabic literature. We also have poems that say, no, 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 I still love him even though he has a full beard. And eventually this spawns enough literature that we have a whole genre of beard books that are anthologies of poetry about beards or the lack of them. There are exceptions to this age pattern, by the way. Two I will mention briefly. One is Muhammad ibn Dawood, who is an important jurist in Baghdad, contemporary of Ibn al-Mu'taz actually, whose legal works have all been lost, but we have his love anthology of poetry, which is considered the first of a whole genre of love books, love theory books in Arabic, about the proper way to fall in love. And this anthology contains love poetry about women and about boys, just sort of all mixed up together, depending on the theme. Themes are things like falling in love for the first time, or the go-between, things like that. But we also have a long introduction in which the author complains that he's being mistreated by his close friend. And we have from outside the work a whole series of anecdotes explaining that the close friend was his lover, who was a pharmacist. And the relationship was deliberately never consummated because they held to the theory, which we find elsewhere in both homoerotic and heteroerotic contexts, that consummation or sex kills love passion. And if you really value the passion, you won't consummate the relationship, which works just fine for a homoerotic relationship because it doesn't encounter the difficulties I'm going to address in a few minutes about religious sanctions against sodomy. Sort of making the best of a complicated thing. Let me read you another anecdote. This is not a poem, but an anecdote that illustrates a bit more about attitudes. And I've always found this rather surprising. This is from the 10th century. There was a bookseller in Edessa named Sa'd, whose shop was a gathering place for the literati. He was himself a man of culture and intelligence, and he composed delicate poetry. Now, among the rich merchants of Edessa, there was a Christian with a son named Isa, who had a lovely face, a beautiful build, and a charming personality and way of speaking. This boy used to sit with us and write down our verses as we recited them, and we were all extremely fond of him. At the time, he was still a boy in Quran school. Then Sa'd, the bookseller, fell madly in love with him and began to compose poems about him. Soon, everyone in Edessa knew of his passion for the boy. But then, just as their friendship was blossoming, the boy decided he wished to become a monk. He asked his father and mother to permit him to do so, pressuring them until they agreed. They took him to the Zaki monastery on the outskirts of Raqqa. He was then at the peak of his beauty, and bought a cell for him there, paying the head of the monastery a great deal of money for it. The boy took up residence in the cell. Sa'd was devastated. He closed his shop, abandoned his friends, and spent all of his time at the monastery with the boy. The monks became upset with the boy for spending so much time with him, and forbade him to see him, telling him not to let him in and threatening to expel him if he did so. The boy agreed. When Sa'd learned that he was barred from visiting him, he took it very hard. He pleaded with the monks and cajoled them, but they would not budge, saying, "Sin and shame accrue to us from this, and we fear the governor." At this, Sa'd grew more and more ardent and frantic until he actually went mad. He burned his clothes and then went back to his home and burned it to the ground. He took to wandering around naked in the desert around the monastery, reciting poetry and weeping. I'm leaving out a little bit here, but things continued this way for some time until one day Saad was found dead next to the monastery. The governor at that time was Everett K. When he heard about this, he went out to the monastery, accompanied by the people of Araka, who were all crying, "It was no one but the monks who killed him." Ibn Khaled told them, "The boy must be beheaded and his body burnt, and all the monks must be flogged." He was very unyielding about that, but the Christians were finally able to ransom themselves and their monastery by paying a fine of 100,000 dirhams. Subsequently, whenever the boy entered Raqqa to visit his family, the children would yell at him, "You murderer of Saad the bookseller," and shower him with stones. It got so bad that he finally stopped coming to town at all and eventually transferred to the Samayan monastery. I have not heard anything of him since. There are several stories parallel to this scattered through medieval Arabic literature, but I thought the most interesting part was the townspeople's reaction to the death of Saad, which I think I don't have time to comment further on right now. Yeah, it should be fine. Another aspect of the role business that I can point to is the medical tradition. In medical works, sodomy appears, but only passive sodomy, because that's what's pathological and not active. And there's a whole discussion about what makes people, meaning mature men in this case, desire to be penetrated. With disagreement, some saying it's entirely physiological, their nerves are screwed up. And others saying, no, it's entirely psychological. This argument, this debate, is another thing that seems to be inherited from the Greeks, who debated the same thing. In this case, we actually have evidence, because there is a text, the Problemata of Pseudo-Aristotle, which is a lengthy work treating all kinds of topics, has a whole section on sex, and has this debate. And we have two Arabic translations of the Greek, plus a modification of it in Arabic as well. So we don't know who did the translations, but at least we know there was actually a textual trail there with regard to this controversy. Mentioning medicine, I should point out that topics of homosexuality, I mainly talked about anecdote and poetry. Now I mentioned medicine, but the topic turns up in virtually every genre you can think of in different ways. In fact, this book that I'm trying desperately to finish, I originally planned to organize according to discourse, where I would have a chapter on literature, and a chapter on law, and a chapter on medicine, and a chapter on Sufi mysticism, and so on. But the chapter on literature turned into 5 chapters, and so I'm sort of in a quandary now about how to deal with this, thinking probably what I'll do is change the book to deal basically with literature and reserve most of the other material for spin-off articles, but I haven't quite thought that through yet. That's my project for the summer. Mentioning the Sufis, the mystics, there's a whole controversy about homoeroticism among them, which is furthered or encouraged by a practice they had, some of them, which is referred to as the shahid. Shahid is the Arabic word for witness, but in Sufi terms it's a technical term where the mystical worshippers take a beautiful boy, set him in front of them, and contemplate him as a reflection of the beauty of God. This was not well received in all quarters. Down through the centuries, it was repeatedly attacked, and with it a more general attack that the Sufis all are really into boys, and it's a bad thing. It also had its defenders, and I would note that among the defenders is, I mentioned Al-Ghazali, the famous religious scholar. His brother Ahmed is a famous mystic, and he defends the practice of the shahid, and is said to have, in his case, when he contemplated the boy, along with other people, they would set down a rose between them and the boy as a symbol of the chastity, if you will, of this whole procedure. Before I move on, anything about law yet, and that's the other piece I need to talk about. The Quran mentions sodomy only obliquely. It never describes it. What it does describe repeatedly is the experience of the people of Lot, parallel to the biblical account, and the demand of the townspeople to have for Lot to give them the 3 angelic visitors for sexual purposes, and the subsequent raining of fire and brimstone that destroyed the town and its inhabitants. Medieval exegetes uniformly assume that what is being discussed here is in fact sodomy. But the Quran, while saying it's a sin, it does say that explicitly, offers no specific punishment for the act of sodomy, which was a problem for the jurists. The Quran also, by the way, mentions 3 times the beautiful boys in heaven who serve as cupbearers and serve wine, which is not forbidden in heaven, unlike earth. And some literary figures, not religious figures, argue that the reason the wildan, as they're called, are there is to be satisfying the sexual urges of the men in paradise, parallel to the houris, the women mentioned in the Quran a few times, who are definitely there for the sexual gratification of men. This idea that this is what the boys are about, rather than just being cupbearers, is restricted to what I would loosely call secular sources. And there's one other passage that is sometimes taken to refer to homosexuality in some sense, and this one I will read you. It's tortured in its wording, and it's worse in Arabic than in English. It says in 2 verses, "As for those of your women who are guilty of lewdness, call a witness 4 of you against them, and if they testify to the truth of the allegation, then confine them to the houses until death takes them, or until God appoints for them a way. And as for the 2 of you who are guilty thereof, punish them both, and if they repent and improve, then let them be. God is relenting, merciful." The problem is here we have, part of this is in the dual, speaking of 2, in Arabic you have the dual number. The other part is in the plural. You have the 3rd person feminine, and you have the 2nd person masculine, and no matter how you cut it, it doesn't make sense. And the exegetes were tortured over this. But in general, they agreed that both verses were about fornication, heterosexual fornication. Some of them said one of the verses is about married people, the other about unmarried people. There were various other solutions. There was one maverick exegete in the 10th century who said the first verse is about lesbian activity and the second one is about male-male sodomy. We know about this because it gets repeated in legal studies or legal books for centuries, but always to be refuted. He was a complete maverick. As it happens, however, at the beginning of the 20th century, the Egyptian Rashid Rida, in a very influential exegesis that transcended the Arab world to most of the Islamic world, took up this idea and put it in his exegesis without citing any historical source, as if this is obviously what the 2 verses are about. His influence has been so profound that now the general unexamined view is that in fact these 2 verses are about homosexuality. But that's a complete shift. I will come back in a few minutes to other shifts. So, if the Quran is really ambiguous about all of this, what do you do next if you're trying to discover, they would say, Islamic law on the topic? You go to the transmission of hadith, that is, traditions about what the Prophet Muhammad said and did. Unfortunately, many of the hadith, of which we have thousands and thousands and thousands, are forged. And one of the main operations that was done in the Middle Ages was to sort out the sound ones from the forged ones, with mixed success. There are several very harsh hadiths about sodomy. Basically, the Prophet says, if you find 2 people committing sodomy, kill the upper one and the lower one. Or sometimes the other version is, kill the doer and the done to. Unfortunately, the transmission of these is highly dubious. So many jurists refused to use them because they didn't believe they were right. Some jurists, however, did accept them and wrote into their version of the law capital punishment for sodomy. However, left undiscussed in what I'm saying now is what's the rules of evidence for this? I will come back to that in just a minute. Throughout the Islamic legal world in the Middle Ages, disagreement on important points was sort of everywhere. It was a very loose, uncodified system. So one legal school says one thing, one says another, and they're all sort of equally authoritative. Some people said, well, if we throw out these hadiths, maybe we can analogize sodomy to fornication and get the penalty from there, because we have a definite penalty for fornication or adultery, which is basically for unmarried people 100 lashes, and for married people stoning to death. Unfortunately, however, well, fortunately, I should say fortunately, this can only be imposed if either the people who've committed the act confess to it voluntarily 4 times before the judge on 4 different occasions, or 4 mature adult, that is, Muslim males witness the act of penetration. And if only 3 do, they're punished for some false accusation of adultery with 80 lashes. This means that the punishment of zina, as it's called, of fornication, is almost impossible to enforce. And from what we can tell, we don't have court records until we get to the Ottoman period, but in general it seems prosecutions were extremely rare. And when we have any evidence of them, it's almost inevitably going to be because of confession. And people would confess because they really worried about what's going to happen to them in the afterlife. That was a serious consideration. But notice that one thing that's weird is if you say, okay, well, analogize from zina to sodomy, then if 2 men commit sodomy and one of them is married and the other is unmarried, then the unmarried one gets the lashes and the married one gets stoning, which is not really very sensible. Other people say, no, you can't analogize, they're 2 different things. So we're left with the simple declaration that the act is a sin with no punishment specified, so that the punishment is up to the judge. And it's always understood that when the punishment is up to the judge, it has to be lighter than any tied down Quranic punishment would be, so it would be a relatively light sentence. And a few people said, it's not punishable at all. So there's a whole range of attitudes. I should take a minute or 2 to, okay. I should take a minute to say something about female homosexuality, which I really haven't said anything about. It's difficult to talk about lesbianism in medieval Arabic sources or Islamic sources in general because there's not a lot of material. Male homosexuality or sodomy or homoeroticism is everywhere. Female, much less so. I'd say less than a 10th the frequency. Much less than a 10th, actually. We do find some things. All the writing in medieval Arabic is by men. The only thing women are composed with some poetry. There are a couple of exceptions, but we're getting the man's point of view. And when we do get discussions of lesbianism, either in the erotica, which is a rich tradition in Arabic, or in anecdotal literature and other things, and some poetry, the general view seems to be men just find it really strange. And it seems to be, how could women not realize how wonderful men are sexually? And they express it that way. And we have debates where one woman defends having her female lover, another one has her husband or her male lover, and they argue back and forth. And it's not always clear which one's going to win. You see it go both ways, but you also see repeatedly the one who loves women hasn't ever tried men, and then she tries a man and she thinks, oh, that is much better. And so they're converted. This seems to me to be a real masculine fantasy, but it gets in the way of seeing how lesbianism really works. So the evidence is difficult to deal with. An example is, I had a disagreement with one of my colleagues some years ago about the question of role for females. Is there a lover and a beloved as there is for males? I said in print that no, I had never found anything. It seemed that role was entirely missing from lesbian relationships. I was contradicted, and I think correctly so, by this Dutch colleague who said, if I had looked at some of the later medieval literature, which at that time I hadn't, you do find roles. And as far as I can tell from what I've seen of the literature, that is a diachronic difference, but I can't explain why you don't get roles in the early period and you do in the later period. In the law books, in fact, whether you analogize to fornication or not, what you get is a long discussion of fornication and adultery, which is inevitably followed by a shorter discussion of sodomy, and then sometimes by a few lines about female homosexuality, where it is assumed that there is no penetration, and therefore it's a minor sin, and so nobody punishes it. I've said nothing, and perhaps I should have said something about all of this down on the ground in society. We have to take into account, basically, privacy, which is an important value in medieval Islamic societies. It has been argued that the laws on fornication are such as they are, not so much to prevent fornication, but to prevent corruption in the public sphere. In other words, keep it quiet. Seems to lie underneath a lot of what we see in the text. Just a couple of things that don't quite fit in my organization here, but I didn't want to leave out. I would note that there is some discussion of sexual activity among males that is not sodomy, but there's very little. Kissing comes up a fair amount. And kissing is a bad thing, but they're not going to prosecute for kissing. What's striking is how rare any references there are to oral sex, almost completely missing. And it's a real question why that should be. It is not because they're prudish. The Arabic literature in the Middle Ages is the very opposite of prudish. It's all over the place and it's right out front. So you would expect there to be full discussions, at least references to oral sex. The only place I really found it is in one poet, one of my unfavorite poets actually, from the 9th century, who refers to it maybe a dozen times in the course of his poems, always in a negative context, in fact. Cultural contradictions. I think the evidence I've been presenting to you shows that we can't come up with a single coherent view of homoeroticism and related things in these societies. They were not completely consistent. And we have to live with that. They did. And an interesting parallel would in fact be wine. Wine is strictly forbidden explicitly in the Quran, and yet wine poetry is almost as popular through the centuries as love poetry. Descriptions of wine are all over the place in glowing terms, and we know this is not just a literary phenomenon. We know people caliphs had drinking parties frequently. Some caliphs drank more than others, some caliphs didn't drink at all, but in fact the forbidding of wine through the centuries has often been observed in the breach. So maybe it's not quite as surprising that attitudes towards sodomy, depending on your context and your discourse, move around and disagree with one another as well. There are contradictions. Now, quickly now, I will make some briefer comments about the modern world. And the most important thing to say, and here I'm getting out of my comfort zone, I must admit, is everything's completely different. Starting in the 19th century, late 19th century, in ways that have not adequately been tracked by scholarship yet, there was a complete turnover in attitudes, which is unquestionably mainly due to colonialism and, more generally, Western influence. There's a great irony here, because all those influences in the late 19th century come from a West that is under cultural mores that I can roughly describe as Victorian. And the middle classes in the Islamic world began to pick up those attitudes. I may have time to read very quickly. Yeah, it's very short. I'm quoting from a book called Before Homosexuality by a colleague of mine, Rowson. The young Egyptian scholar Rifat al-Tahtawi spent the years 1826 to 1831 in Paris as part of a scientific delegation sent by the modernizing ruler of Egypt, Muhammad Ali Pasha. Tahtawi went on to write a description of the manners and customs of the Parisians, as well as of the scientific institutes of the city. The work is an important landmark in 19th century Muslim rediscovery, quote unquote, of Europe. One of the things that Tahtawi found noteworthy was that the French were, quote, not inclined to youth, and considered pederasty, quote, extremely disgraceful. In the French language, a man cannot say, I love the youth, for that would be an unacceptable and awkward wording. Therefore, if one of them translates one of our books, he avoids this by saying in the translation, I loved a young female or a person. And this article also quotes the famous lexicographer Edward Lane, who also wrote Manners and Customs of the Modern Egyptians, saying at one point he translated some Arabic love songs sung in Egypt and merely told the reader, quote, I have substituted the feminine for the masculine pronoun, for in the original the former is meant, though the latter is used, as is commonly the case in similar compositions of the Egyptians. I think, and then the author here says, I think it is clear from Tahtawi's comments and from the contents of extant 18th and early 19th century Egyptian love poetry that Lane's claim about the gender of the portrayed beloved is highly questionable. I would modify that just a little bit to say that the phenomenon of writing in the masculine about women is not entirely missing, even in the medieval period. It has a name, it's called tazkir, and there are various explanations for why occasionally poets do this. But it doesn't explain most of the poetry, particularly when the poem describes the beauty of the down on the beloved's cheeks, for instance, or names names even. Most of the homoerotic poetry is homoerotic. But by the time we get to the late 19th century, the Victorian ideas about this have begun to spread in the Islamic world, and that continues. It spreads through more of society in the early 20th century, and with a couple of generations, you have what amounts to amnesia about the situation before the 19th century. And this is the great irony, because, okay, 19th century, you've got the, quote, libertine East and the puritanical West. And then there was this. And the situation we have now, of course, is the libertine West, frowned on by even relatively liberal Muslims often, and the puritanical East, which not only denies the role of homoeroticism and homosexuality in their history, but in fact mostly doesn't know about it. That has partly been aided by the fact that unlike the situation before, say, 1900, 1920, valorization and censorship of books and articles is extremely common in the Middle East, whereas until 1900, nobody ever censored anything really for sexual reasons. I would just close, I would point out some of the contradictions that remain in what's become this complicated situation with vestiges of the old attitudes still around. Some recognition of role is still the case in the Middle East, in Arabic and other languages. There have been some neologisms proposed to provide a word that means homosexual in the Western sense. As far as I can tell, these have not really taken hold. So the language itself preserves some of the old attitudes. And certainly calling somebody a passive sodomite in Egypt, the place I know best, is probably the most vicious insult that one can hurl at a male. And you wouldn't do that to somebody who takes the active role. So you've got layers of attitudes, modern attitudes that look much more Western, plus these vestiges of traditional medieval attitudes. I did a study of argot, secret languages in Cairo a long time ago, and one of them was the gay community, who called themselves gay in Arabic because they needed a word. We also see references to some of these hadiths that were so vile and vicious. I mentioned the execution would kill the upper and the lower. There are also ones that say if they're caught doing sodomy, they should be thrown off the highest building in town. Others say they should have a wall collapsed on them. There is no evidence that any of these things ever happened before the 20th century, but they've been taken up to varying degrees by the Taliban, by ISIS, and that's actually happened. To a lesser extent, places like Iran are prosecuting sodomy and homosexual behavior in a way that is quite different from the situation before the 20th century. In Cairo, in Egypt, sodomy is not illegal, but lewd behavior is, and that is used for periodic raids on what is becoming a real gay community of sorts. Right? Maybe don't even need to say of sorts. So there's a lot of hostility out there in varying degrees. There are also burgeoning movements in some Islamic countries on the other side. I would say from what I know, and I am outside my comfort zone, Beirut probably has the strongest gay organizations. I don't think there are any gay pride parades in Islamic countries yet, not counting Turkey, which it definitely does, but not Beirut maybe. And there's some of this activity in Cairo. Elsewhere I know less. If I have just a couple minutes more. Final thing, it's a little bit of a tangent, but I thought I would mention, is the situation in Iran with regard to a topic I have not addressed tonight, but I thought I'd mention briefly, which is transgender. In Iran today, it is widely known in the Middle East that if you are transgender and want to get a surgical operation done for it, you go to Iran. It is the place to have those operations done. Westerners often find this odd and perplexing. Iran, of all places. But from the Iranian point of view, it makes perfect sense. Because while in contemporary Iran, homosexuality is frowned on very heavily, what's wrong with it is two people of the same sex having sex. Whereas transgender people get reassigned to what proper sex they really should have, and then they are functioning in a heterosexual environment, so that's fine. It's a solution, not a problem. So, I think I've spun through most of the things I wanted to talk about, so maybe I'll just stop there. Thank you for your attention.
We have a few minutes for questions, if anybody would like to ask any.
Thank you for your talk. The last narrative on that transition between Victorian Europe and the more liberal Middle East, and then that switch was also mentioned in the book Sex and the Citadel.
Oh, yes.
And I really liked that narrative that was there. I just returned from an extended stay in the Middle East, actually, for nearly 10 years. And I can confirm that a lot of what you said on the contemporary issues are indeed the way the state of affairs is right now. However, I want to talk about a little bit more about maybe if there's going to be a reverse in that ideological thinking that homosexuality being banned by law. My time was in the Sultanate of Oman, and while there by law it is illegal, there's quite a diverse and thriving subculture of which everyone knows about and recognizes. And so I've seen that in the Gulf and other Gulf states. I recently was in Lebanon, so much more open over there, and a lot of people view Lebanon as the party country when you want to leave the Gulf and go explore yourself in Lebanon. But I'm wondering, do you think there would be a shifting attitude? I know Saudi has usually been that clamping force on that liberalness, but with Saudi changing and the region maybe changing, is there a shift occurring?
I can't pronounce on that. I think there are possibilities because, there's been heavy Western influence before in a different way, and there's certainly heavy Western influence now. Pressure, some would say. There's a whole argument I don't want to get into about that. But also, I would like to think, but perhaps they were optimistic, that further knowledge of their own history would be helpful here. and facing up to the fact that things were not always, attitudes were not always anywhere like they are now. But that may be more of a wish than a prediction. You mentioned Oman. I've never been to Oman, but I've read about the Hanifs in Oman.
Yeah, Muhannath and Khanif,
Yeah, the effeminates, which I've written about in the time in the first century of Islam, is a tradition, these transvestite men who have various functions in society, but they're completely institutionalized and mainly survive in, of all places, Oman today. So you said there's quite a range.
Yeah, and those dancers are usually now in weddings.
Yeah.
They appear in the north of the country. And
Right. What I really think somebody should do, and it has to be a modernist do it, is figure out what I'm sure are actually the historical connections between the effeminates of the Islamic Middle East and the Hijras of India. Because they're very, very similar. And nobody's tried to trace this historically. Yes.
oh, sorry.
You're next.
I was wondering who the maverick was, who said that the verse about confining houses were about homosexual relationships.
Of women.
Yeah.
His name is Abu Muslim. He's not terribly famous. 10th century. I get him mixed up with the other guy from about the same period, also a jurist, who had a famous debate. No, he was a theologian. He and another theologian had a debate about whether there will be sodomy in heaven, which is still being reproduced in legal books in the 19th century.
Thank you, Professor Rowson, for coming to talk with us. Really appreciate it. I have a question about gender inequality. Did the medieval Arab men, maybe Middle Eastern men generally, sort of like the ancient Greek men, as I understand them, feel that women were way inferior to men, whether the male was adult or young teenager, that they were all inferior to women, no matter what, especially in sexual matters. Was this a big attitude, sir?
I would say it was a big attitude, yes. It's not the whole story. But, yeah, women being lower on the totem pole than men is certainly the majority opinion of the men. And there's they justify it in part from a couple of verses in the Quran that seem more or less to say that. It is complicated by the fact that you have whole gradations. These are highly hierarchical societies. And the people who are on top, so to speak, are not just the men. They are the adult, free Muslim men. And everything that contradicts one of that slides you further down the scale. And so it's not going to be all the men at the top and all the women at the bottom. It's going to be much more complex.
I see. Thank you.
Is that why the passive recipients and partners in the early Islamic poetry happen to be, and I'm just noticing it, all Christian?
Yeah, all Christian. I thought about that when I picked the anecdote of the poem, but it represents something, a strand in the tradition, but it's not as prominent as my example might lead you to believe. In the collected poems of Abu Nuwas, in the section on love poetry about boys, it's subdivided into, there's a whole section on Christian boys, poems about Christian boys, but there's also a whole section on boys working in the bureaucracy and other things.
I have one more question. I was wondering, I know I had seen some things recently, ISIS chat lists and things like that, in which the beard is fetishized, like, you know, a whole internet conversations on how to condition the beard so that it's nice and masculine and full. And I'm wondering, you know, since there was such fascination with the first down of the boys, was there literature on beauty cultivation involving facial hair in the early Islamic period?
It's hard hard for me to answer. I think the context for that would be the Prophet as a model. Because this is the kind of thing where the law doesn't say you've got to do this. But if the Prophet did this, it's a good thing to do. And it's embodied in the Hadith here. So there, I'm sure, I mean, people I know call sunnah beards a certain way of wearing the beard that's religiously sanctioned. Goes up and goes back somehow or another to that kind of material. Where it's developed in between, I'm not sure. What I've seen in literary works is these beard anthologies, which is a completely different thing. But fetishizing the beard is, I think, a fair enough phrase, because the beard is so central, it's all over the place. The only men, mature men who did not have beards in most Islamic societies before modern time were the effeminates who depilated or plucked their beards, and the eunuchs, who were a significant part of society as well and had no beards. And if you really wanted to shame a man, there are two ways of doing it. You shave off his beard, or even worse, you shave half of it off. Making it obvious that this is a punishment. Anything else?
So, I mean, looking at the Islamic sources in the medieval time, do you think, in comparison with modern time, do you think, it seems to me that, Arabs or Muslims in medieval time were more liberal, if we were to use this word, more open-minded to these things, take into consideration all of these manuals for like sexual life, like the perfume garden.
Right.
So what is the take on that?
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. They were more liberal. One way to characterize this has been described at length in a book that I have mixed feelings about, but parts of which I think are very insightful in German, but I think an English translation is in the process of being made by Thomas Bauer, with the title something like The Culture of Ambiguity, in which he argues that ambiguity was central to many features of medieval Islamic societies, and not only tolerated, but cultivated. And therefore, in that sense, they were more liberal. You could hold on to religious tenets, but that doesn't mean you didn't go around and not sin.